response to those forces, especially when we get into our discussion of strengthening, which we're going to talk about a lot next week and the week after. We understand that when a force is applied, okay, it's only going to cause motion when it has a direction and a magnitude, right? Okay? And the direction that in which that force is being applied is going to determine what happens to the body the force is acting on. And again, remember, in this context, we're talking about body, any physical body, not a human being's body. Right? Clinically, we're going to address how it affects the human body. We're talking about any body, any object. Okay? So when we're talking about body in this lecture, we're not just referring to the human body. There could be multiple forces that act on a body, on an object, on a mass. And what happens to that body, the movement that occurs, is going to determine on the direction at which the force is being applied and the magnitude of those forces. And when we're combining multiple forces that might be different magnitude or different direction of application, we're going to create vectors that show if there's a lot of force being pushed. Again, we'll take this example. If you look at me and I have a force that's being exerted, a high force that's being exerted from my left to my right, and a smaller magnitude that's being exerted in the same direction from my right to my left, in which direction is this body going to move? To my right. Okay? So that's all we're talking about. We're talking about resultant force vectors. It's determined by the direction of the force and the magnitude of the force. Okay? When we talk about gravity, is that a constant force? The force itself is constant, right? If gravity is acting on a body, is it always going to affect the motion of the body? Think about this carefully. We're going to look at this again in a few minutes. Gravity is always in what direction? Down. Specifically where?
Towards the earth. Towards the earth.
Toward the center of the earth, right? So it's not offset. It's always toward the center of the earth. But a body, including human body, might not be perfectly oriented towards the center of the earth, right? A body may be at an angle to the center of the earth, so gravity may affect it in different ways. This is a fancy way of saying, as we know, we have patients, for example, do an exercise in a gravity-eliminated position, in a gravity-assisted position, or in an anti-gravity position. Yes? Give me an example of those three situations. Simple example. Somebody doing an exercise in a gravity-eliminated position. You know examples. Yeah?
Treadmill underwater.
Is gravity eliminated?
A gravity assist, I guess.
Well, we're bringing in another principle which we'll talk about, and that is buoyancy. But not really a good example. Yeah? Side-lying elbow flexion. Or, so you're doing shoulder AB adduction in what position? Supine would be an example of what? Gravity. Is it truly gravity eliminated? No. But you're minimizing the effect of gravity, because gravity is still acting on that limb, right? But it's certainly what we would generally call functionally a gravity-eliminated position. How about an anti-gravity position? Would simply be standing abduction, right? Could you do that gravity-assisted? Invert them, yeah, invert them, right? Well, now it becomes not active abduction. It's probably going to be more an eccentric adduction, right? Yeah, it's a lot of paperwork. But yeah, so we're saying the force may be constant, but the direction of that force is going to result different resultant forces. Okay? And simply put, that resultant force is just the force that produces the same effect as all the other forces acting on that body. You're adding them together or adding and subtracting. You're looking at the direction into which the force is being applied to come up with a resultant force. And this is just a simple illustration. It's not showing magnitude, right? It's just showing direction. But again, if we looked at this example, if we said that the force, the direction that you see on the left of your screen, and you've got another force being directed on the right side of this slide, if we're saying the resultant force is the arrow in the middle, which magnitude is going to be greater, the force on the left or the force on the right? The force on the right, right? So we're saying that middle arrow would be our resultant force, okay? This is all relevant because when we start applying resistance to the body, the direction and magnitude in which we are applying that resistance is really key if we're trying to create a specific motion to either assist or resist that force, okay? And even if the resultant motion is zero, there's no motion. When do we apply a force when there's no motion? What kind of exercise is that? Isometric, right? There's no change in length of the muscle. We're still applying a force, but we don't want to see any motion. And you use that example, that isometric force, let's say we want them to do an isometric shoulder abduction exercise, direction and magnitude, right? We're trying to exercise the shoulder abductors. Where is my force being applied to the limb? Superior or inferior?
Superior.
Direction and magnitude, right? Where is my force being applied to my right limb if I wanted to exercise the patient with an isometric shoulder abduction? Superior, so it's a superior force. And what does the magnitude of the force need to be in order to produce an isometric contraction? Equal to the force that they can produce. So is that going to be the same in every person? No, of course not. And if my force vector, if the magnitude is too great, what's going to happen? You will overcome the force of that individual. They will not be able to maintain that shoulder in an isometric contraction. Yeah.
Be equal to or less, right? Could be less.
If it's less, what's going to happen?
Gonna keep going.
If the force that I'm offering is less than the force that they're producing, what's going to happen? They will abduct.
Okay, well, what if you're asking to just kind of hold it there?
If you're asking to modify how much force they're producing, well, yeah, then you're going to modify the force that you are offering. Yeah. If it's maximal, if you're asking to produce maximal force, then you're going to need to match that force, right? Okay, that being said, is it possible that I could be working with someone who is able to generate more maximal force than I can resist? Sure. Sure. If you ask me to do that on an NFL lineman, good chance that he'll lift me off the ground. It's entirely possible. Maybe not shoulder abduction, but in some other actions, in some other movements, yeah, sure. But again, we're talking about magnitude and direction here.
And it's described as a superior force or superior inferior? Either one.
Well, superior, inferior is the direction. The force is being applied superiorly, superior to the limb. Above, it's directed in a superior, inferior direction. So if I say where is the force being applied, that's different than in what direction is the force being applied, right? If I apply a force inferior upon the limb, it means I'm applying the force here. If I'm applying it superiorly, I'm applying it here. I'm not saying where on the limb. It's just superior, above the limb. Okay. So that brings us to our discussion of levers. Again, it's not physics, but we need to understand the impact and the presence of lever systems in the human body, in any body. So a lever, we're simply going to define, or a lever, is a rigid bar that rotates around an axis. Okay? And that lever is going to be three elements to any lever or lever system: an axis, a resistance force, and a moving force. Okay? If we want to overcome the resistance and create movement, then our movement force has to be greater than our resistance force. Right? We're going to define these forces, the resistance arm is a length, is a distance. And the resistance arm is measured as the perpendicular distance from the axis of motion to the line of resistance. Okay? We'll look at this again in a minute. Better illustration. The force arm is that distance where the force is being applied, the distance from the axis to the moving force. So, you've got an axis of motion, and you've got force being applied to that lever. That distance is referred to as the force arm. And you've got a resistance arm, which is measured as that distance from the axis to where that resistance is being applied. Okay? In the human body, the axis that we're referring to is the joint itself. And we know, we're going to see when we look at these joints in more detail, very few joints in the body are a true hinge. Okay? The axis moves. But there's still going to be an axis at any point in the range of a particular joint. The axis is not fixed. But that joint is considered the axis, and the body segment itself around that joint is the lever. Right? There are three types of lever systems in terms of mechanical principles. If we're talking about any object or any body, there are three types of levers. One is a first-class lever system, where the axis of the motion is in between the force arm and the resistance arm. Similar to what you see in a seesaw. The length of the force and resistance arms vary. Okay? In a seesaw, the axis is right in the center of the seesaw, right? That's a seesaw. So here would be, just assume that this is just a straight board, like a seesaw. I place the axis directly in the center. That's what we see in a seesaw. Okay, but if we're saying the length of the force arm and the resistance arm can vary, this would also be a first-class lever system. This would also be a first-class lever system. When we say it's in between, that doesn't mean it's directly dead center of the lever. Okay? But it's in between the force arm and the resistance arm. In this example, where's the resistance arm? Left or right of the axis? Resistance arm.
Where your hand is in front of it. So, all right.
This is the resistance arm. If I want this to move, where am I going to apply the force? Here? No, I'm going to apply the force on the other side of the axis. So here's my resistance arm. Here's my force arm. Okay? And where's the resistance arm? Bless you. Where's my resistance arm? Left or right of the axis? It's still right of the axis. Where's my force arm? Left of the axis. Am I going to have to use more force to cause movement here? Yes, because my force arm is much shorter than my resistance arm. Okay? If I find dead center here, this will be balanced. The force arm and the resistance arm are equal in length and magnitude. This would be balanced. Okay? So don't get confused. When you see the example of, a first-class lever system is like a seesaw, don't think that automatically the axis is dead center. Okay? Can you think of an example where this exists in the human body? A first-class lever system? Does it exist anywhere? Yeah.
At the atlanto-occipital joint.
Atlanto-occipital joint. So what are the bones that make up that joint? I hear mumbling. Spit it out, anybody.
Atlas, occipital.
The atlas and the occipital condyles of the skull, right? So yes, the skull is balanced on the atlas. That's considered a first-class lever system, okay? And if the head is going to remain perfectly balanced and aligned. The forces acting on that joint need to be equal in magnitude and direction, right? So yeah, there are first-class levers in the body. A second-class lever, the axis, which is always the axis of rotation, is at the end of the lever, and the force arm is larger than the resistance arm. And the example they give here is a wheelbarrow, as an example of a second-class lever system. And the long force arm makes it possible for you to have generate large resistance with little force, overcome a great amount of resistance with little force. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. Here is a second-class loose. Here is a second-class lever. Right? Here's our axis of motion. Very long force arm. Here's where the force is being applied. Oops. That's a second-class lever. Similar to a wheelbarrow, right? The wheelbarrow, the axis is here, right? So here's your second-class lever. All right? And again, you can move large resistance with little force. You've got a very long lever here. Force arm's very long, so you're able to overcome a great deal of resistance. In a third-class lever system, the axis of rotation is also at the end, but the force arm is smaller than the resistance arm. Okay? Longer resistance arm than the force arm is a third-class lever system. Longer force arm than the resistance arm is a second-class lever system. But remember, the example we gave of that first class, you still had long and short force arms, right? But the axis was in the middle. Here the axis is at one end. That's what we see in our human body, right? The axis is at one end. The one example we gave was the atlanto-occipital joint, where the axis was more or less at the center between the force arm and the resistance arm. The advantage of this kind of lever system is you get a lot of speed of the distal segment. That's really what this lever system allows in the body. And you're able to move small weights over a long distance. Okay? And it says it occurs frequently in an open kinematic chain. Again, here's our example. Right? Long lever. Where's the force being applied? Well, we said this is a third-class lever system. If we assume that the resistance, the center of mass, which we haven't even talked about yet, the resistance arm is somewhere out here, further distal from the axis. Here's where my force is being applied. Whoops. That's where my force is being applied. So I create movement distally. One of the advantages of this, if you really look and see, you get a large amount of movement with not that much contraction. If this string contracted rather than me simply pulling on it, you'd see a large amount of movement with not that much shortening of the string or the muscle. It's one of the advantages of this kind of lever system in the human body. Okay? But we have to overcome a fair amount of resistance, right? I don't need to exert much force to move this. I need to exert a fair amount of force to cause movement here. Okay? And that's because of the lack of mechanical advantage in that third-class lever. Okay? That's a concept that we need to understand. It's the ratio between the length of the force arm and the length of the resistance arm. Okay? If the force arm is very long and the resistance arm is very short, you have a great mechanical advantage, a large mechanical advantage. It's a calculation. The length of the force arm, let's call it 10 inches. The length of the resistance arm is 2 inches. That's a ratio of 10 to 2 or a ratio of 5 to 1. Okay? Anything above 1, anything above balance, remember, if the ratio is the same, If the length of the force arm is 10 inches and the length of the resistance arm is 10 inches, 10 divided by 10 is 1. It's balanced. The force and resistance arms are the same in terms of their distance and their magnitude. The forces are equal. Okay? Again, remember, it's not just where the force is being applied, it's direction and magnitude. All right? The reverse is, if the resistance arm is 10 inches and the force arm is 2 inches, now your advantage drops to 0.5, 0.05. Okay? So you have a very poor mechanical advantage. Okay? It's less than 1. So anytime you see a force arm greater than the resistance arm, you're looking at a mechanical advantage in that situation. And the longer that force arm, the greater the mechanical advantage. We're going to talk about that more. Okay? Torque, remember, torque is a measurement of force in what type of movement?
Rotation.
Rotation, or rotary movement. Okay? So we're applying force and we're causing movement in an arc. Degrees of motion. It's not a transitory force or transitory movement. We measure that distance in terms of inches, centimeters, feet, yards, miles, whatever. But in a rotary movement, we're measuring in terms of degrees. And we said the force is being applied perpendicular. In a rotary movement, that torque is determined by formula. It's the product multiplied, the force times the perpendicular distance from the line of action to the axis of motion. Okay? You have an axis of motion, it's causing rotation. Right? In order to produce movement, we've got to cause that object to rotate. We can't measure it as simply being perpendicular to this straight object. We're talking about a round object now. So now our calculation is going to be different. I'm not going to be asking you to calculate things, by the way. Just understand we're measuring it differently. Where this may be measured in pounds, foot-pound, or newtons, the amount of force that I'm exerting here, that rotation is unit of measure is going to be torque, foot-pounds, or meter kilograms. It's distance and mass. Okay? Just understand that torque is what we're going to be really looking at most often in the human body, because most of the rotation that occurs, most of the movement that occurs is not transitory. It's not linear. It's rotational. And we gave that example on Monday when we were talking about an anterior drawer and a Lockman's. Right? The anterior drawer is really a rotational movement because we're fixing the distal segment. Right? We're fixing the foot. In a parallel force system, all the forces that are acting on the object are in parallel. They may be in the same or opposite directions, but they're parallel with each other. And we add those forces together to determine what the resultant force is. Again, gave the example of jumping, right? If I produce force down into the floor, and I'm producing more force than the floor is pushing back on me, than the floor is offering, I'm going to push off the floor. If those forces were equal, I wouldn't move. I would stay stationary. Okay? If the force was greater, let me make sure I explain this. The ground reaction force is less than the force that I'm pushing against it. That's what causes me to rise. If it were the other way around, if I overcame the force of the floor, I'd sink into the floor when I pushed into it. If the forces are equal, I would stay stationary. Obviously, this is a constant. The ground reaction, the firmness of the floor, the firmness of the earth, I'm going to easily overcome that force, right? I'll be able to overcome the force of gravity, and I'll be able to rise up. I'll be able to push off the floor, all right? But again, we're looking at force that's being applied in which direction, and with what magnitude to determine what's happening to the body. Okay? We can break down these forces into two components. Again, magnitude and direction. And use this to actually see what's happening when we're looking at angular forces, forces that are being applied in different angles on the human body. And that will help us determine how much torque is being produced. We can actually calculate that. We can actually calculate the muscle force that's being produced. We can measure the muscle force that's being produced. And what unit of measure would we use if we're looking at the amount of force that's being produced to create rotation at that joint? What's the unit of measure? That's good, that's correct. Newtons we're going to talk about later. Well, we're going to be measuring torque, right? That's the type of force that we're going to be measuring, torque. It's producing that rotational movement in the body. But we can actually calculate this. You're not going to. But the way that we go about doing this, if this was a pure physics course and we were simply looking at the physics, we're actually going to draw a parallelogram and look at the angle of the force, the magnitude, the angle at which the force is being applied to a body or an object. We're going to look at the magnitude of that force, and we're going to calculate it. Calculate what that resultant force would be. Okay? We do that using trigonometry, and you've seen this before. Okay? But keep in mind that as we change the angle at which that force is being applied, the resultant force decreases. So, again, if I am applying a force perfectly parallel to this object, I'm going to get X amount of force. If I start applying that force at an angle other than directly perpendicular, the amount of force that I'm going to produce decreases. That's my maximum force. Maximum moving force is when I'm perfectly perpendicular to the object that I'm trying to move. Well, that's not what happens in the human body, right? All of our muscles attach at different angles to the bones, to the bony levers that they're moving. And that angle changes as we move. That angle is not fixed. It changes as we move through a range. So the force that's being produced by that muscle is going to change because the angle at which it's acting on that bony lever is changing. The resultant force is going to change. Even if the magnitude of force stays the same, because it's not being applied at the same angle as we move through a range of motion. Okay? When that angle is becomes zero, the forces are in line with one another. Well, what does that mean? Okay? Here, what is the angle? If I apply a force in this direction, perfectly perpendicular, what is this angle? What's that angle? 90 degrees. So if we said that the angle of application of force is decreasing. Here's 90 degrees. Let's call that 80. Let's call that 60, 50, 40, 30, 30. If I get to 0 and if I apply a force, here's my joint. What's the resultant force? What is the action that's occurring on this joint? Distraction. So if I apply the force in the opposite direction and I get all the way down to 0, what kind of force am I applying to the joint? Compression, right? So again, remembering in the human body, that angle changes at various points during the range of motion of any joint. You may be getting a little bit of distraction or a little bit of compression, right? So it's not just that it's going to cause rotational movement, rotary movement. You're probably getting some distraction, some compression, and you, in fact, are, depending on the angle that the joint is placed in, right? And this is the way we calculate these forces with that parallelogram is using the Pythagorean theorem. Just bring back bad memories for some people. Remember SOHCAHTOA? Bring back bad memories? What does SOH stand for? Do you remember? Sine over hypotenuse times over the sine over opposite times hypotenuse. COH, CAH. What is it, CAH? Right, right. And tangent equals opposite over adjacent. Opposite times adjacent. Okay? SOHCAHTOA. And again, we've already mentioned that if we want to perhaps reduce stress on some joints, we may actually perform an exercise in a gravity eliminated position. You see that it's in quotes, right? Because the example that Dave gave was somebody doing shoulder abduction in supine. And I said it's not gravity eliminated. Why is that? Gravity is always present, right? It's still there. And it's actually pressing that limb down into the table or the mat or the floor. So it is offering resistance, different kind of resistance, right? It's the direction in which that force is being applied. Magnitude is the same. The only difference is, instead of that being force, that force being perpendicular to my resistance arm, it's at a different angle, right? Only place that we can do gravity eliminated exercise? In space. Not a vacuum. Space. Okay? Vacuum is the absence of atmospheric pressure. Doesn't eliminate the force of gravity. But we can use Archimedes' principle, which is the principle of buoyancy, to do exercise in an aquatic environment, right? We're using buoyancy to reduce the effect of gravity, right? So we are really not talking about gravity eliminated, we're talking about gravity minimized or gravity limited positions, not gravity eliminated, right? Now, we apply force to a body, we've got to talk about the body that force is being applied to. Okay, the center of mass of any body is the point at which that body is perfectly balanced. The force arm and the resistance arm are equal. Right? And I said, we can find, I'm not going to bother, but we could find the perfect center of mass of this object, even though it's an odd shape. Right? We could find that center of mass and it would be perfectly balanced. Okay? In symmetrical objects, in objects that are perfectly symmetrical, it's going to be the center of that object. Perfectly symmetrical. There's an equal amount of mass on each side of the axis. So the center of mass of that object is going to, the center of mass of that object is going to be the direct center of the object. In asymmetrical objects, it can be a little difficult, a little more difficult. You could see that the center of mass of this object that's got different amounts of mass in different areas of the object, it's going to be a little more difficult to identify exactly where that is. Probably somewhere off center here, maybe. All right. In the human being, in general, it's located just anterior to S2, second sacral vertebra. In general. Okay, it's not a perfect measurement. Are humans symmetrical? Clearly not. No one is symmetrical, including differences between left and right. We are not symmetrical. So that center of mass is going to vary from person to person. But in general, it's located just anterior to S2, yes?
So the center of mass more like an all-encompassing term. It differs from center of gravity like it could be in space, and that's why we have...
Center of mass relates to the object itself. Center of gravity relates to where force is being applied to that object. Okay, the center of mass is a constant, right? It's for any particular object, it has one center of mass. Okay, unless we change the object. Okay, so for example, if my center of mass is located just anterior to S2, have I just changed my center of mass? Yes, I changed the shape of the object, right? The minute you change the shape of the object, the minute that you move some mass in that, remember I said, Center of mass is in the dead center of a symmetrical object, okay? I could probably, if I were completely still, you'd be able to find the point where I'm going to be balanced, right? And let's say I'm on some type of a pivot, or what's the term I want? I'm going blank on it. Anyway, if I were to start moving where my limbs are placed in space, am I changing my center of mass? Yes, because I'm moving some mass of my body in different directions. I'm adding some mass anteriorly. I'm adding some mass laterally. Gravity is going to work on me differently as I move the arms in different positions. Okay? As long as the shape of the object stays the same, even if it's not symmetrical, then the center of mass is going to be a constant. The minute you change the shape of that object, which I just did, now the center of mass is going to move. And you know that, right? You know that if you're holding something in your hands and you're holding it close to your body, the effect on your body is very different than if you hold that same object away from the body. You feel like you may fall forward because you've just shifted the center of mass of that body. And now we're talking about gravity shifting. We're talking about what happens to that body as we apply force to it. Okay? Okay? If we talk about a body being in equilibrium, again, stable equilibrium, that means the body returns to position after a light perturbation. Perturbation means you're causing just the slightest amount of force to try to disrupt or move that body. And as long as that force is not excessive, that body will return to its original position. And we would refer to that position as stable equilibrium. Unstable equilibrium, the body will seek a new position after a light perturbation. Okay, the body is going to move. Seeks a new position means it's going to move. And again, remember, when we say body, we're not just talking about human body, we're talking about an object. Okay? So again, let's put a ball on the table here, or this. Okay? If it remains in stable equilibrium, if I apply a small amount of force, slight perturbation, it's going to return to its original position. Okay? Unstable equilibrium, if I give it a little more force, it may not return to its same position. It seeks a new position. Okay? Neutral equilibrium, the center of gravity is going to stay the same, is going to be displaced, but it remains at the same level. So that's an example of a rolling ball. This is not a ball, it's a cylinder, right? Center of gravity of option stays the same, even though it's moving. It's in neutral equilibrium. These are just physical principles that you want to be aware of. Okay? But when we look at stability of an object or of a body, the amount of the stability of that object is going to depend on the height of the center of gravity above the base of support. Again, you've heard this before. What's my base of support? Where my feet are contacting the floor, right? And the higher my center of gravity is, the more unstable my equilibrium will be. Yeah, Chris?
The difference between unstable and neutral equilibrium, they're both moving to a new spot.
But the center of gravity in the neutral equilibrium, the center of gravity is not changing. That's only going to occur in a cylindrical object. We're not cylindrical. Right? Okay, so the center of gravity is going to remain the same, but movement is still going to be positive. And we talk about, again, how stable a stable equilibrium will be. It's the height of the center of gravity above the base of support, the size of the base of support, the location of the gravity line or the line of gravity within that base of support. So again, I know you guys have done this before, right? I start shifting my center of gravity anterior, posterior, laterally. I'm shifting, changing my equilibrium, right? Now gravity acting on my center of mass is going to cause me to move in a particular direction. If I move my center of base of support, center of mass forward, the center of gravity shifts. Again, center of gravity is where gravity is acting on that body. I'm going to tend to fall forward. If I shift my center of mass back, center of gravity shifts back, I'm going to tend to fall backwards. I'm going to have to do something to maintain that position. Okay? And the weight of the body itself, obviously, in relation to the base of support, is going to contribute to the stability of the object, or the stability of the body. All right? We're talking about what's going on in terms of the mechanical principles. You've talked about, well, if you want to be more stable, you want to widen your base of support, right? Okay? Why is that? Because you're creating a more stable equilibrium. You're widening your base of support. Everything else is staying the same. Your alignment, your center of mass, right? If I do this, am I raising or lowering my center of mass? What do you think?
Which way?
If I move from this position to this position, I am widening my base of support. You would agree? What am I doing to my center of mass? Is it getting higher or lower? It's getting lower. You could measure it. It's going to get lower. And again, we said the height from the base of support is one of the things that will affect the stable equilibrium of that object. If we lower the center of mass and maintain the same base of support, you're reaching a more stable status. If I maintain the center of mass and widen the base of support, you're still increasing stability of that object. Well, I can't maintain my center of mass when I do this, right? If you measured me from the top of my head to the floor, my head is closer to the floor here than it is here. Only fractionally, but it is closer. So I did lower my center of mass when I assumed that wide base position. Okay? The line of gravity, we know, is always toward the center of the Earth. And the line of gravity is always from the center of the mass to the center of Earth. Center of the Earth, downward. Okay? And that body, that object, is going to be stable when the center of the line of gravity passes directly through the center of the base of support. Okay? We know that's the case. If the force is being applied and pushing me off center, I'm going to be unstable in one direction, in the direction that force is being applied. The larger the base of support, the more stable the object is. Right? And again, we know that. You experience it, but you want to think about it, what's happening from a kinesiological standpoint. It's a way of describing something using kinesiological principles. Okay? When we talk about stability and base of support. Again, we've already said the majority of lever systems that we see in the human body are third-class levers. Remember, what's a third-class lever? How do we describe that in terms of the relationship between the axis and the resistance arm? What is a third-class lever? Remember? The resistance arm is longer than the force arm. Right. That's how you would define it in physical terms, in kinesiological terms. The resistance arm is longer than the force arm. So the muscles have to exert large forces to overcome that long resistance arm. The external resistance, due to the lever arm lengths, okay, the resistance arm is very long. So we're going to have to generate a lot of force. Where is that resistance coming from? What causes, we have this third-class lever, okay, which we said was this example, okay, where the force arm is shorter than the resistance arm, right? So what forces are we overcoming? Gravity and somebody said it. Weight of what? Of this, right? So the weight of the limb and the force of gravity. So there are two forces that we're looking to overcome, not just gravity. This arm doesn't have a mass of 0, right? So we're always overcoming the weight of the object or the mass of the object and the force of gravity. Yes, Chris?
This might be a dumb question, but don't things only have weight because of gravity?
Yes. Yeah, that's why we talk about it being weightless when we're in space. There is no weight. Well, we always have weight. Gravity is always acting on us, even underwater, right? That's why we sink underwater. Unless the buoyancy of that medium is equal to the force of gravity, then we'll float, all right? But in the world that we live in, gravity is always acting on us, right? So gravity is always present, but unless we're somehow overcoming that force with some other force, like buoyancy, we're gonna tend to move towards the center of the earth, okay? So muscles have to generate a lot of force, all right? But again, the example we gave before, but that force will cause a lot of movement distally. That's the advantage of third-class lever systems. Yes, they need to generate a lot of force to overcome the resistance of that long resistance arm, but you get a lot of movement distally. So small amounts of muscle, change in muscle length causes a large degree of movement distally. That's why those third-class lever systems are so efficient in the body. And they're really designed more for speed than strength, okay? Small amount of contraction of the muscle causes a large amount of movement and a higher speed of movement, okay? That's what we're illustrating here, all right? We can again draw a diagram of how these forces are acting on the body, and we refer to those as free body diagrams. Okay, it's a simple way of demonstrating the direction the force is being applied, the force arm, the resistance arm, where is gravity acting on this object, where is the center of mass of the object, right? And where is the force of gravity being applied? And we refer to those moment arms, not just force arms and resistance arms, as internal moment. When we look at it in the human body, the internal moment arm is the distance from the insertion of the muscle perpendicular from the axis of that movement, of that joint. Where does that muscle insert relative to the axis of that joint? That distance is referred to as the internal moment arm. Makes sense, it's internal, it's within the body, right? The external moment arm is the perpendicular distance from the axis to the external force or the body's center of mass. And again, we say the body, this could be the forearm, not just the human body, the forearm itself. Gravity is acting on that object, the forearm, and the forearm itself has a mass. All right? The external moment arm is where that force, center of gravity and center of mass is in relation to the axis of that movement, or the humeral ulnar joint. Right? Internal moment arm and external moment arm. We can calculate these forces that muscles are producing and acting on joints, right? We can use those force diagrams to calculate those forces. If you were really, really into biomechanics and you really wanted to study what happens to the joints when forces are applied to them, you would have to calculate these forces. And that's when you'd use your free body diagrams, which you're not going to do. Don't need to worry about that. Okay? But when it comes to applying resistance to the body, in function and in the exercises that we apply, that we use, usually that external resistance occurs distally in that individual, right? Usually that's where our resistance occurs. And that's where we apply resistance. Okay, the effect of gravity is more distal than proximal. As we move against gravity, okay, the resistance is being applied more distally than proximally. And we need to understand and be aware of the effects of gravity depending on the position that we put our patient in. We've already talked about that. If you want to change the effect understand that there's torque that is produced at every joint. Okay, we're not just measuring, even though we have a weight that has 4 pounds, and we put a 4-pound cuff weight on the ankle or the forearm or the wrist, or place it in the hand, whatever, we are creating torque at that joint. That's okay. That's going to happen. It's not bad. We just have to recognize that it's happening. And if we're trying to control that torque, we have to understand that we're going to either need to change the amount of resistance, the amount of weight. We have to change how they're moving in orientation to the force of gravity, the position that we're placing them in. And then we're going to change how those forces are acting on that body, on that joint. Okay? And understand that we may not appreciate it fully, but if we're having the individual put a weight around the ankle or the wrist distally, that it does create traction on that joint. If I put cuff weights on my wrists, am I creating traction at my humeral ulnar joints? Yes. Am I applying traction to my glenohumeral joints? Yes. We just have to understand that it's occurring, and it may be perfectly fine. Right? Even though we may be just doing an exercise for the forearm or for the elbow, we're still applying a traction force to another joint. And again, it doesn't mean we avoid it, but we have to recognize it. Okay? Everybody knows what a pulley is, right? Round object, you may run a rope over it. This is a pulley system, even though there's no round object here. This metal eye is acting as a pulley, right? A single fixed pulley doesn't really provide any mechanical advantage. This would be a single fixed pulley. Doesn't really apply any mechanical advantage. It just changes the direction of the force. Okay? So again, if I don't use the pulley system, I'm applying a force in this direction. If I use a single fixed pulley, now the direction of the force is changing. It's not perpendicular, it's at an angle. Okay? So that's all a single pulley does. Okay? And we may use single pulley systems in therapy, such as in cervical traction. One single pulley, we apply weight. It simply changes the direction of the application of force of that 10, 15, 12, whatever kind of weight. It changes the direction of force. A movable pulley does create a mechanical advantage. Okay? And if we had a movable pulley, this would be a pulley that moves. This is not, this is fixed. Okay? The angle of pull is changing, and the axis of motion is changing. Okay? It requires that the rope or pulley must be moved twice the distance that the weight is raised. Okay? But you need less weight to cause the movement. You need less force to cause the movement. That's the mechanical advantage of a double pulley system. Have any of you seen a patient in skeletal traction? No? That's too bad. I hope you get the chance to see it. That you work with someone in skeletal traction. Number one, because it can be a little intimidating, but you also have to understand how it works. You'll see someone, anybody know what skeletal traction is used for? When does a patient generally get placed in skeletal traction? Not pelvic traction or cervical traction. Skeletal traction. Any idea? It's usually done when somebody is awaiting surgery for a fracture, for a skeletal fracture. Okay? Why would we apply traction to a fractured bone? Can you think of a reason? Yeah.
It's like displaced tibial landing properly.
Right. Exactly. That's why. If my femur fractures mid-shaft, are the muscles still acting on that femur proximally and distally? They sure are. What's going to functionally happen to that femur? It's going to shorten. It's going to shorten. There's still tone in the muscle. It's going to shorten. So if I want to lengthen that bone, I've got to apply traction to that femur to realign. I know it sounds gross, doesn't it? To realign those fracture ends. So they applied skeletal traction. it may take a tremendous amount of force to restore that normal alignment of that bone, femur, humerus, whatever the case may be. It may take a tremendous amount of force. Well, if I use a movable pulley, I need less force, because that pulley system allows for greater amounts of motion with lesser amounts of force. So it might only take 20 pounds to apply that traction, as opposed to if it was a single pulley, it might take 100 pounds. Okay? Because 100 pounds is tough to move. 20 is not. Okay? Anatomical pulleys that we see in the human body, right? Anatomical pulleys, they change the direction of force that a tendon is applying to its attachment. Okay? Not the insertion of the tendon. We talk about muscles having insertions, not tendons. Tendons have attachments, distal or proximal attachments. And they increase the mechanical advantage by moving the axis by moving the course of pull of the tendon away from the axis of rotation. Okay, the example is the patella, right? The patella acts as an anatomical pulley. The tendon of the quadriceps inserts on the patella. The tendon of the patella attaches to the proximal tib, right? The quad tendon, which connects the quad muscle to the patella. Generally speaking, we refer to the proximal portion as the quad tendon. Distally is the patellar tendon. How else is this referred to? What other term do we apply to this structure? Well, I said patellar tendon. What else could it be described as? What do you think? You've seen it. What do we call a structure that attaches bone to bone? A ligament. You may see this referred to as the patellar ligament or the patellar tendon. Okay? And when we talk about the knee, we'll understand why that is. But you may see it described both ways. If you see patellar ligament, what you're going to want to know is, well, which patellar ligament are we talking about? Because there are multiple ligaments that attach the patella to the femur and the tibia. All right? But you may see it described as the patellar ligament as opposed to the patellar tendon. Okay? But that is an example of an anatomical pulley. Okay? It's to increase the mechanical advantage of the quads to cause knee extension. Okay? The greater the internal moment, so the greater the angle of insertion, the greater length of insertion, the greater rotational movement of that by that muscle at that joint. Okay? An example of that is the biceps. So this is a very important concept whose internal moment of arm changes in relationship to the movement, the range of motion of that joint. Right? Remember we said the angle changes. Okay? So the insertion of the biceps does not change, but the angle of its pull does as we go through a range. Insertion stays the same, but the angle changes. Okay? If we talk about stretching versus joint mobilization, we understand it's not the same thing, right? What's the difference between passive range of motion and stretch? Real simple question. What's the difference between passive range of motion and stretch? And I'll tell you why I asked this. I saw a therapist one time document that they're the same thing. Passive range of motion and stretching are the same thing. Give me a definition that defines them differently.
The passive range of motion brings it through the range of motion before the stretching is applied.
What's another way of putting that? You said through the range of motion.
To the end range? Yeah.
End range.
Available.
Available range of motion. Right, the available range. Can I stretch you beyond your available, can I move you beyond your available range of motion and do it passively? Can I passively, well, what do I mean by passive? I'm doing it, you're doing nothing, right? That's what passive is. So can I move you beyond your available range passively? You're passive. Yes. What do we call that? Stretching. That's stretching. I'm moving you beyond your available range I'm doing it passive. You're the passive person, right? I'm moving you. So I'm active, you're not. It sounds like a simple, it's very important to keep in mind because you don't want to fall into that trap. You know, if you're performing passive range of motion and you encounter resistance, what do?
Stop.
You're performing passive range of motion, you get to a point where you're encountering resistance, what do?
Stop.
Stop. No, don't slow down. Stop. You've reached the end of the available range of motion. Anything beyond that, you're stretching. Is it your intention to stretch? Well, it better be, because if you go beyond it, you are stretching. And yeah, that matters if we're working with post-op patients. It matters what the available range is, because we may need to stop at a certain point. All right? Yes. So there's a difference between stretching and passive range of motion, and there's a difference between stretching and joint mobilization. Okay? If we're trying to stretch a joint tissue, we're creating a lot of stress to that tissue. We're moving that tissue beyond its available range. Okay? Joint mobilization does not necessarily involve stretching. You already know that because we have different ways of grading that joint mobilization, right? Give me an example of a grade where you're moving a joint through a range and you're only working early in the range. What do we call that? Grade and grade 1 and grade 2, right? And if we're trying to stretch those joint tissues, what grade would that be? 5. 5. You're going beyond the available range. Grade 4, you're not going beyond the available, you're going to the end of the range. Grade 1 and 2, you're working in the beginning of the range. Right? So if you're moving, you're applying an AP force to a joint, you're moving anterior, posterior, grade 1, grade 2, you're beginning at the beginning of the AP movement, A towards B. You're only in the very early part of that range. You're not even getting to mid-range. When you start talking about grade 3s and 4s, you're getting to the end range. When you talk about grade 5, you're going beyond the end range. That's where you're manipulating. That's where you're stretching. And if that's our intention, that's perfectly fine. But we better realize the difference between stretching and passive range, right? Is joint mobilization passive range of motion? What do you think? There's not really a wrong answer, right? Is it passive? Yes, it is passive. Is it range of motion? Yes, but the range is measured at the joint surface, right? So it's not measured in degrees. So we're going to have to be very careful that we're clear on our terminology. And it is why it's not a good idea to refer to joint mobilization as passive range of motion. If I said perform passive range of motion on my elbow, what would you probably do? You'd probably tell me to lay supine, perhaps, and to relax and allow me to bend and straighten your elbow. Remember, you're talking to a patient. You're going to use their terminology. Just allow me to easily bend and straighten your elbow, right? If you're going to apply joint mobilization to me, I might be in the same position, but are you going to be performing the same movement? No. And if I read that you did passive range of motion of the elbow, what am I going to be assuming you did? This. That's going to, and then you would assume the same thing, I would bet. If I said joint mobilization, you're probably going to assume something different, right? We apply force, right? It's got a direction and a magnitude. That force is being applied specifically on somewhere in the human body. The amount of pressure that we're applying is measured by magnitude and the area in which that pressure is being applied. Okay? If I apply a small amount of pressure in a very small area, the net effect is much greater than if I apply that same amount of pressure over a large surface area, right? The net effect of that pressure is tremendously reduced because I'm applying it over a large surface area. Again, difference between placing my hand on someone's forearm and placing my index finger on someone's forearm. I apply the same amount of pressure, same amount of force. The resulting force is much greater because I'm centralizing where that pressure is being applied. I'm applying it over a very small surface area. Okay? We do want to apply pressure to some tissues because we do want to get some response from that tissue, whether it's stretch, whether it's increased hypertrophy, growth in the tissue, whether it's muscle tissue or skin, changing direction of collagen fibers in a healing tissue, right? We are applying pressure at times. But if we're not recognizing how much pressure and how much surface area that pressure is being applied to, we may cause tissue injury. Again, if I'm going to perform a stretch to this person's elbow flexors, and I do it with my finger, I'm focusing my pressure over a very small amount of surface area, I'm going to cause tissue damage, as opposed to distributing that force over a large surface area. The pressure will dramatically decrease. Same force. Okay? Again, the only two ways that we reduce that pressure is decreasing the magnitude of the force, which might not be practical. If we're trying to accomplish something, we may need to apply a lot of force. So either we're going to decrease the magnitude of the force, or we're going to increase the area that that force is being applied. The third factor is decreasing the time. Okay? You can apply a large amount of force over a large surface area for a few seconds, or you can do it for a few minutes. The net effect is going to be different on that tissue. We're going to talk about that more when we look at tissues more in depth. Right? The time of application is a third factor. Okay? So, to finish up, we know that there are different forces that can be applied to a body, including the human body. We know the body responds differently depending on that force. We know that two major categories of forces are transitory and rotary. Most of the forces that we see applied to the human body are rotary forces, not transitory. We understand Newton's three laws and the impact that they have and how we utilize those laws in therapy, especially in exercise. And we understand that we have different lever systems that exist in the body, and the most common is the third-class lever system. Okay? We understand that the moment arm changes in our limbs because the angle of insertion of our different muscles changes as we move through a range. That means the net effect of those forces, or the torque, is going to change through the range of motion. Torque is our measurement of force. We understand that gravity has an influence on what we do with our patients and how we position a person in relation to gravity. We're going to get different effects. We have to understand how that occurs physically and from a kinesiological standpoint. We understand that we can create free body diagrams that actually illustrate and calculate how those forces are acting on the body, and that we're using these forces clinically. We're trying to create change in the body. And when we get into our discussion of strengthening next week, then we're going to talk about how the body adapts to those forces. Okay? All right. Questions? Yes?
I have a question. Can I stand to demonstrate? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So center of gravity and center of mass. If the question basically is if you could change the center of mass by moving your arms like this, does that change it?
Changing the center of gravity. You're moving remember, center of gravity is where gravity is acting on that body.
But
You're changing your center of gravity.
you're also changing the center of mass.
You're moving your center of mass in relation to gravity, but the way to think of it is gravity is now acting on that body differently because you've changed the shape of that body, which will move the center of mass of that body. Remember, the body has when we say body, don't just think human body, an object, right? This object has a shape. I just changed the shape of this object.
So you change the center of
Right?
mass.
I just changed its shape, I just changed it again, right?
Yeah.
So the center of mass of this body is changing as I change its shape.
But also
Okay.
the center of gravity.
Center, once I apply a force to it, right, without any force being applied, I've changed the center of mass.
So they both have to change, basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
the effect of gravity on that body. You're changing the center of where gravity is being applied to that object.
Okay. I just
Okay.
didn't see how the center of gravity changed when I did this. Because if it's still at S2,
But remember,
Like-
everything, what are we referring to, the center of mass? Everything is from the reference anatomical position,
okay.
right? It's
So-
always from the reference
So my center of
anatomical
gravity
position.
changed here, and my
Yep.
center of gravity changed here.
And it changed here, and it changed here, and
Okay.
it changed here,
Okay.
and it changed here.
That's my question, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
You got at least similar.
See, do you have like a poster of Timothy Chalamet or something, because I talked about it so much.
You'll have what?
Like a poster of Timothy Chalamet hanging in your room.
Oh, it's not because of him. It's because I read both his books, and I thought they're pretty good.
It's because you were like so hyped about it.
I'm looking forward to like what my vision is in my head compared to like, also Dennis Figueroa.
Not your picture, I'm just talking about the ID.
He's a really good
I'm talking
director.
about the ID. Wait, it looks like
Dennis
paper.
Figueroa,
Yeah, he's a good
Where'd you
teacher.
get it online?
he's like really good.
Where'd you get it online?
You can do it down online.
I mean, I think they did justice to the sandworm.
That's the real ID one?
Yeah, the new real IDs are like fake. It's awful.
I got my COVID ID.
They feel like really crappy.
Weird, right?
It's a driver's license.
No, but it feels like a fake ID.
Oh, but it's not a real ID.
No, it is. It's a real ID. It's a real ID. If it was fake, it'd be from Connecticut or New York.
No,
It's your driver's license. This is not the real ID. You need a real ID. In a couple of years, if you want to leave this country, you need what they call a real ID.
Oh, they're doing that too? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I have my COVID ID.
What's that? They will take the fake real ID.
If you want to travel domestic,
Yeah, even if you want to travel domestically, you need the real idea.
Yeah, 2023, you need a real ID.
yeah, I gotta get one. Was that during orientation?
Wait, is the real ID the thing that you get with your, that's a star?
Passport, no. Different.
Oh, it's different?
Yeah.
How do you get the real ID?
You gotta,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, because there's so many fake IDs out there, is that the issue?
yes.
But I'm
Joking when I said 90% of my life is like, the other 10% is not.
Donofrio, Nate, you're saying, guys, says hello. From you, said
Oh, that's good, thanks, yeah.
he said he used to call me the Segway. I'm working with your boy Jeff tomorrow.
Oh, good luck.
I'm really not excited about that.
Ah, it's,
How do you get 6 IDs?
well, you'll see the difference. No, he's great. Yeah, no, Eric's great. I like,
He just listens to his patients very well. Like, he's
Is there a picture?
he has that demeanor for that.
Eric is awesome.
Yeah.
Like I try, like he's a great clinician. He's just jacked up.
Yeah,
I'm very impressed with Eric.
Yeah. Where?
We got,
I know you do. So I came in, I'm talking my last question about like this box. But yeah, I'm gonna fight for well. We're gonna fight for days and all. That's good. Legit. Yeah, like you fight on the road.
I give you a, no, we do a review, like PowerPoint class. I give you a review quiz.
Which lecture is this?
We're gonna finish up the neuroanatomy, and then we'll get into the assessment one.
Oh.
Who's not here? Who are we missing here? But Andre, so usually over there. Who's next to you?
We're checking your neuro.
Are you just spread out? Okay.
We're checking your short. Checking your legs, visual.
Oh, yeah, but yeah.
Let's see. We lost Spencer along the way. Where'd he? Alright. Who else? Monica's there. Who's up? Who sits up there?
Here.
Oh, you guys move? Oh, that's fine.
Studying the party.
No, I didn't see. Isaiah was hiding back there.
Jerry Jr.'s up.
21. Oh, we're good. Okay. Chris is in the vet.
My defensive line.
The Bacalhau.
I just kicked down the door.
You guys filling out your neuro study guideline?
I'm just a little scared that they're gonna cry.
Yeah, we'll cover some neuro assessment today. Next week we'll start motor learning, motor development. The following week will be some pediatric stuff, stroke, and then test. So probably 3 weeks for test. Then I'll make sure, I'll talk to Professor Mailly, make sure my test is the same days as his. Just, listen to you complain and not do anything about it.
Oh, it's like that time we had a quiz, but it was really an exam. Remember that?
Yeah.
Well, she always says like quiz, like her quizzes are always exams.
Yeah, but it was an exam. That was an action. No, she never downplayed. I mean, yeah,
Well, you guys, all these guys questions,
don't worry.
8 parts each.
8 parts each. I remember you walking out, like, trying to be funny, but you were genuinely pissed off.
He was so.
Like, that was not a quiz. Like, you just
Yeah, I remember
walked out.
that.
Who said that? Devin. Oh, yeah, I remember that.
We all did fine.
Trying to
Alright, here we go. So we're gonna start off, this was this was Monday's lecture. We start with the reflexes, it's after the upper motor, lower motor neuron. So if you got nothing going on over the weekend and you're gonna reread, or, no one tapes here, do they? I wouldn't want to listen to myself either.
No, I listen to you at night.
Man.
No, I like laugh. Listen there, yeah.
Really?
red light district.
Yeah.
Damn. The last voice he hears.
Wow.
Listen to your
All right. We got the A. Oh, forget
try
it.
to sleep, meditate.
Yeah.
Actually, just while I'm in the shower.
You got a kid, you got no time to shower.
I was showered 3 days.
That's why I smell so bad.
Yeah, so review, look at the anatomy, get the anatomy down, it's gonna make everything easy. All right, just get everything down. So. All right. We're gonna segue with it.
There's no segue, guys.
Yeah, I know, where is it? What's going on?
Throw something at you, check your reflexes.
I'm good. All right, nothing else, I guess nothing going on.
Diabetes sucks.
Does that also make your reflexes better or worse?
Probably better, feel good,
Caffeinated.
yeah,
Alert.
feeling good.
Stimulating.
It's more the taste, like
That's fine.
I never drank coffee in my life. In fact,
I know.
so I had a patient. Who, when you travel, when you would go to like the train station, when you go to the airports, you remember like the company Hudson News? I think they've been sold.
Yeah.
So I actually treated the guy that was Hudson News. And the guy was just like beyond wealthy. So, and I'll bring him up again when we talk about locked in and other neurological disorders. But I, like his personal therapist, I would go over there. So I go in one day, he's like, hey Tom, we're going to Florida next week. I'm like, all right, no worries, see when you get back. He's like, no, you'll come with us, wheels up at 11, you'll have a car down there for you, you'll get paid, you can stay in the house with us. I'm like, okay. I'm like, can I have my wife and daughter fly down? I'm like, oh, they can come with us if you want to bring like your nanny or babysitter. I'm like, oh, wife, nanny, babysitter, all the same. So I load up the car, we go to Teterboro, park the car, and like a swarm of guys come out, they got everything but the car, load it in the G5, boom, and off to Florida we go. Get down there, I forget what the point of the story was. So we were talking coffee, yes. So anyway, every night we had a formal dinner. Like I'm wearing a suit for dinner. They have like a private chef and like help. These guys are awesome. And they serve coffee, and I was embarrassed to say no. And that night, embarrassed to say no. I don't drink coffee because I was like formal. Like really like dinner, just amongst people, like formal dinner. Have to wear, like I'm wearing a suit just to have dinner with these people. And I'm drinking the coffee. That night, I'm lying in bed and I'm like to my wife, I think I'm having a heart attack. How old was I? See, my daughter is 20, so it was like 19 years ago. So I'm like 35. I'm like, I'm gonna die. You gotta call 911. She's like, relax, you had coffee. So after that, I was like, dude, this coffee stuff sucks. But then I took, we went on vacation, we took the kids, we went to Italy, tracked the routes. And in the morning, I'm up early, I'm walking around the city, nothing going on, I'm sitting. The bar was, you get your coffee, your espresso, your cigarettes, and your lottery ticket. And people would stop in, they'd have that, and they would move on. Here's like a Dunkin' Donuts here. And I'm like, there's gotta be something to this espresso. There's like, hundreds of people coming in and out. I'm like, I'll try one. Sit there, I'm like, this stuff isn't that great. Go back the next morning, I do it again. I'm like, it's not that bad. By the third day, I was addicted. I was doing like three times a day. Yeah, that was it. And it hasn't stopped since. And now I'm drinking like alien juice. That's right. Chris, he's drinking. I'll bring it in.
Kyle will get you on the stuff.
Kyle will just get you taking straight caffeine pills.
Yeah, but again, just as I am like a beer snob, I become a coffee snob. It's got to be like craft. I won't do Dunkin' Donuts.
As long as it's got caffeine in it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Really that great.
Yeah, it's really that great.
What's that?
Coffee.
Where?
Oh, it's in South Jersey. It's like Homedale, Point Pleasant, Red Bank.
All right, if I head down there, I'll check. Like this Gregory's coffee is horrendous, and they're opening one up in Granite. It's it's beyond disgusting. Like they should be, like that barista should be embarrassed to serve it to me.
Wait,
It is
Gregory.
Gregory's coffee.
It's a New York chain.
Yeah.
Oh, it's bad?
It's horrendous. Oh, it's horrible.
Pizza or bagels either.
I hate to say it. I mean, Starbucks is their stuff is pretty good. I hate to say it because it's so big, although
It's like burnt
I-
and strong.
yeah, I mean, I bought some stock as a joke because my wife was just not drinking nothing but Starbucks, and then it went to the moon. Yeah. I think I bought it at 25, went up to 100, it split, and then now it's back. It's insane.
Like 117 or 18.
Is that what it is now? It's insane. Yeah. But my son bought Tesla. He bought one share of Tesla three years ago.
Oh, nice.
Well, it's nice if he doesn't listen to his father. So it went up to like it went like 350. So he bought it like 250. He went up to 350. And I'm like, dude, this guy Elon Musk is nuts. I'd get out. He's like, no, it's gonna be good. I'm like, I get out. Like, I'm not just gonna keep giving you money because you want to buy something. So if you want to buy Lululemon, which you wanted to buy, at 100, which is now 440, I'm like, you got to sell something to buy something. Oh, okay. So I sell Tesla.
Oh, God.
Goes up to like 2,000.
Oh.
And every day when we look at it, he's like, you owe that $11,000 now. $250 a year, $250,000 to raise kids.
How many?
$250,000 what it costs
To raise for 1 year of child.
to raise, yeah. But that's not saying that's not what you're gonna lay out. It's like what you lose other stuff.
What do you mean overtime?
Overtime.
One from zero
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, you don't just have a kid and have $250,000.
No,
I was gonna say,
that's
like,
what it's called,
ridiculous.
yeah.
It's like a lot.
God forget what it was. I forget what it was. Maybe it's like 250,000 per kid.
It's my car payments, kid loans.
On average, so that's like.
You're returning 36 months back from birth to 18.
Okay, 18, all right, there you go. $250,000 from birth to 18. If that's not the best birth control, I don't know what is. We talk about pregnancy here, because I do get into women's issues next year. I'll bring that up again. Kids, $250,000 until they're 18. All right, here we go. So now,
That was a good segue.
Joe, listen to me. So if you have any business questions, don't ask me. I suck.
Noted. Not the guy to do.
All right, reflexes. I do know my coffee. Yeah, right. Like that word.
Do you have days where you have less though? So like bring tolerance, 37, not zero, but.
What do you mean, Davis?
Less caffeine.
I'll be like this without the caffeine. This isn't caffeine drink. Yeah, I enjoy being
You're
with
a
you
happy
guys.
guy.
That's what it is.
But
Yeah.
just, as a side note, you do have days where you have less, right?
Less coffee?
Yeah, like less caffeine overall, like a lighter day, like a Sunday or something.
No.
It's constant.
No.
1,000 mgs all day.
It's a
There's the
comfort
day
thing,
and the
like,
day.
I love just waking up and having.
Yeah, no, I know. It's about, I would say an average like 4 espressos a day.
Maybe a wicked left.
It has an equal effect every single
2
day.
cups of coffee.
Yeah, it's not much.
Yeah.
Dude, buddy of mine's a pilot. He's like 60, what does he say? He's like 60 cups a day, he said.
What?
Flying, yeah.
You're
Six
bugging.
bugging. Yeah.
He just needs to try Adderall.
Yeah.
It needs a drug.
So if you fly United, like he flies in 777s, if you see a guy, James Adams, that's your pilot, because you know he's bugged out. You know he's going to be awake. Flying that
Oh,
thing.
man.
Yeah. Maybe that's true. I'm sorry, 60 ounces, 60 ounces. 60 ounces, he does keto, that's fine. He does keto.
There's a big
So
difference.
60 ounces a day.
But that's still a
How
lot.
many is 60 ounces? 60 ounces, how many is 60 ounces?
4 days.
60 ounces.
This is 32.
That's 6 10-ounce cups.
60 ounces.
Alright, so my bad.
Yeah.
That's not a lot? It sounds like a lot.
Yeah. It's like 8 cups a day.
So he's 8 cups of coffee a day.
Yeah.
Alright,
That's really not fun.
60 ounces, my bad, that's a big difference. Alright, that's the segue. I gotta stop talking before I get in trouble here. That is gonna come down. Yeah, I just had him fired. What do you know about this guy? God darn it. Sorry, James.
Pushing drugs to kids.
I get on that place.
I agree with Andrew. Adderall's a hell of a drug. I never try that.
I know, so
Just don't do it if you get man.
Yeah.
Pill in your
Alright, here we go.
Never tried it.
laser and coke.
Now you don't
And
even
I,
know.
as you mentioned Adderall, I got another story in Adderall. Yeah, that'll be another day.
The other day. Does it make your reflexes better or worse?
I don't take it. Again, I don't.
Adderall's like cheating.
I had a friend who was in a bad time. He moved out to California.
So is coffee then.
He got hooked up with this bad dude
Yeah.
who sent him to a doctor purposely to get an ADD diagnosis so he can get the Adderall so this guy can steal it and sell it as terrible. That guy, yeah, he moved there.
Adderall, you just go back to the final with Dave, where we were 15 minutes in and he's asking a question about number 64. It was on like 9.
So,
It's true.
that guy found his way back, that's all I'll say.
Yeah.
Turned around to
Turn him around. All right, here we go, reflexes. So the rest of this lecture is going to be sensory assessment. We're going to do some stuff in the lab. Quick little type of thing. We have back to school night tonight. So, reflex.
Great.
The funny thing about that,
Well, yeah, this is like, Don Bosco, so I gotta make sure I'm like, you know, on my game. Yeah, I gotta behave, yeah.
You're gonna be around my area.
Yeah.
Send the Bosco, man. Bunch of tools, go wave. Go green wave.
The ball?
Del Barton.
Del Barton?
Go green wave.
It's like, so my whole thing, if your kid goes to Del Barton, it's like $500,000 from 0 to 18.
So 42 annually, come on.
All right, here we go. So reflexes. So we're thinking about. So what I had said in the lab earlier, which is very important, we're always assessing, and I think what we have to really make sure that when we deal with our patients and we're dealing with them on a daily basis, we're looking for that change. You know, we can't just assume that they're going to be the same each time. Like numerous times going to the home, like I would have a change of cognition where a lot of times it was just a urinary tract infection. Other times it's, again, some type of infection. I had like a clog of a stent, which would drain fluid into meninges. So stuff like that you guys, as that front line, those acute care workers, depending on the setting you're in, are going to have to recognize this. So part of the assessment we have reflexes. It's the motor response to some sensory stimulation used to assess the integrity of the nervous system. So we did it last year. So the guidelines, you want the patient relaxed, put the muscle on a slight stretch, use the reflex hammer, and you compare both sides of the body. 0 is no response, 1+ would be diminished, 2+ would be normal, 3+ would be brisk or exaggerated, 4+ would be very brisk or hyperreflexive. And the way to determine if one is, say, a 3+ compared to a 2+ would be you assess the other side. If they're the same, then that would be normal. Common sites, bicep tendon is the C5-6 level, brachioradialis also C5-C6 level, triceps C7, patellar tendon L3-4, tibialis posterior L4, L5, which is hard to find, we're not going to find that one, and then the Achilles tendon S1, S2. Sensations are also going to test sensation, sharp, dull, hot, cold, deep pressure, light touch. And again, it could be any type of pathology or injury. Herniated disc, all of a sudden you find out it's getting worse, losing sensation down the way. And again, we'll discuss more of the assessment in the lab. So again, we're looking at any type of pathology, any disease related to peripheral nerve, whether it's a trauma or fracture, herniated disc, central stenosis, where the canal is starting to get smaller and it's compressing the spinal cord, whether it's a stenosis of the intervertebral foramen, where that's compressing on the nerve. Again, something that is going to press the nerve, give us those neurological signs, loss of muscle, decreased sensation, again, wherever it leads to. Other type of diseases, the metabolic, diabetes, alcoholism, can affect that. Toxicity, even people that get radiation from cancer, that can damage the nerve. I had a patient who had a tumor under his clavicle, and he was getting radiation to that tumor, ended up destroying all the nerves, so he had peripheral neuropathy in his one arm just from the tumor. And you'll see that a lot too with lung cancer, breast cancer, where the radiation can damage parts of the brachial plexus as a result. Infections, Lyme disease, HIV. Anybody have Lyme? Anybody get Lyme disease there? You got it?
I'm pretty sure I do. It's self-diagnosed, but I got hit by a tick. I got the target.
Yeah.
Haven't been the same since. I'm pretty sure I got it.
You got it?
Yeah, definitely had it diagnosed and everything.
Yeah, I got it also. Except they diagnosed mine as multiple myeloma. Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Blood cancer?
blood cancer's not as bad.
Yeah. They diagnosed me blood cancer the Friday before Columbus Day and said, hey, next week you got to call an oncologist. So I went into like a depression. I lost like 15 pounds over 5 days. Go to the oncologist, he's like, yeah, I don't think you have myeloma, I don't know what it is. Then the doctor calls up and says, oh, I just got the test, he's got Lyme disease. Like, oh, okay, here's doxycycline, you're good.
Thanks.
Yeah.
No, not to be an alarmist, but.
Yeah, serious. What is Lyme disease? They don't know. It's a toxin that comes from the Lyme tick, and it gets into your bloodstream, and it can mess you up neurologically.
We have a patient with a TBI at UI, secondary to Lyme disease.
Wow.
And a second one from an overdose of antidepressants.
So he was diagnosed with depression secondary to Lyme disease, and then they started administering SSRIs, and he OD'd because of the person administering the SSRIs.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Wow. Gotta be emailing.
Let's see, infections, Lyme, HIV, impingement or compression, arthritis, carpal tunnel syndrome, again, all things that can affect the sensation. Burns, toxins, again, chemotherapy, nutritional deficits, no fasting, intermittent fasting, cause nerve sensation issues. And any type of injury to nerve root caused by, whether it's a CVA, a TIA, MS, or any type of brain injury. So, important, we gotta know our dermatomes and our myotomes. So if somebody has a suspected herniated disc of the neck, I'm gonna do a sensation test on that dermatome, right? I know where my C5 is, my C6, C7, right? I know that, I'm gonna document that. Decreased sensation to C6 dermatome. That'll, as a detective, read me up, hey, you know what, I think this person has a herniated disc to this area. That's my assessment. We're not diagnosing, we're assessing.
Professor.
Yeah.
So, during a lab today, we were talking about the whole documentation thing. So, like, if we're doing these tests, like, oh, person has decreased sensation in C5.
That's it.
Just leave it at that.
Leave it at that.
Not like because of the.
No, leave it at that. Let the therapist and,
Yeah.
do other tests. Again, that we also know. So then the right document that, suspected herniated disc at C5, send patient to doctor for further, evaluation. Yeah, leave it at that. So C1, 2 is facial muscles, SCM capital. C3 would be the SCM diaphragm, upper trap. C4 diaphragm, partial belt, SCM upper trap. C5 deltoid bicep rhomboid. C6 extensor carpi radialis, pec major, 7 traps. A tricep, and then 8. Those are the upper. You guys should know this. Remember, we'll get more into this also with spinal cord, because with spinal cord injury, we need to know what muscles are still innervated, because that'll tell us what we can work on, and then what our functional outcomes will be.
As an example, so I had a guy yesterday had numbness, lack of sensation here, so C6 nerve root. How do we know it's the C6 nerve root and not the median nerve that's being trapped?
You're going to answer your own question, or your classmates can answer. What else do you want to do? All right, so you want to do your,
Intervention tests.
all right, so maybe you can do your Tinel sign. What else? Let's start up high. Sperlings. So I can do my Sperlings test. So one of the things that, when we get more into the orthopedic type stuff, we want to clear joints. So you want to clear the joint above. So if you're concerned that, so if you're concerned that this patient he's got pain in the elbow, right? My steps in there. It's exciting, but like, oh good, I got my 10 steps. Ooh, 8,000 steps, I'm good. So if he's like, yeah, I got, pain here, ooh, he get like an echo. Very different, right? I don't know about that. Did I hear myself twice? That's a real reverb. So what I would do is, he's got pain here, all right, and the elbow, that hurt. If I have full range of motion with no pain, I cleared the elbow. Any pain there? Full range of motion, no pain, I cleared the shoulder. Then I'm going to go Sperling. So you want to look above. So if you're like, okay, what do I have pain, numbness along here. Well, it's not coming from the elbow. I got full range of motion at the elbow. I got full motion at the shoulder. Let me check the neck. I'd actually start with the neck and work down. But if I can eliminate other joints, that could give me more of a focus of what I want to look into. Sperling.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, is it away or is it the same size?
Sperling is same size. Vertebral artery is away. So again, we can, you can certainly assess that, special test that we know. So you want your hands, and then you have your coming across. Right, Casey? Coming across? Show us? I know, I've been going down to your lower area. So C3, 4, 5 supply the diaphragm. C5, shoulder muscles, bend the elbow. C6, wrist back, elbow flexion. C7, elbow extension, wrist flexion. C8, finger flexion. That was just like the layman's term on what to use. So from there, let's go here. Yeah. Perfect segue. So you guys had your dermatomytomes last year. We're going to do it again this year, and especially for spinal cord injury. Because let's say you're quite what's going on here. Let's just say, at what level do you? At what level can you? What level do you think you can ambulate a patient with a spinal cord injury, knowing the myotomes that you know now?
So in other words, at what level and below, he would still, like, if he had an injury to a certain level and down, he'd still be good? Or what level and up?
Well, the injury would be everything from that level up is intact.
Okay.
Everything below would be lost. So where do you think they'd be able to ambulate?
T4.
You're saying T4?
All the way to L,
What do you think?
maybe all the way down to L4, don't they? L3, L4.
So what do you say? Jade?
What is that now? Hip function.
So you're saying L2? Okay, Chris? This is
L2
it.
is hip function. How's that L1 going?
What do you say? All right, you're going T12. Mel?
You're saying, repeat the question one more time.
At what level, for a spinal cord injury, could you ambulate the patient?
But I can ambulate the patient, not necessarily the patient can ambulate on their own, correct?
Yo, L4, L5H is beaten, still walk.
But that's what I'm trying to say, that's why.
You're taking the easy way out.
Yeah, I feel like it's injury dependent.
I actually don't know. So,
So is
All right, so here it is.
Lesion.
Spinal cord injury or at what level? So I guess it depends on what you want to consider ambulation. You have household ambulation. You have, you have therapeutic ambulation. Therapeutic ambulation, I can walk a patient at T12. However, they're going to need like hip, knee, ankle, foot orthoses, Craig Scott orthoses, where they're locked in. And I'm there and I'm moving. So therapeutic ambulation is the type of a gait where we're looking to get the therapeutic benefits. Standing, weight bearing, circulation, digestion. So that's the therapeutic. There's household ambulation. Household ambulation, somebody can walk short distances by themselves, maybe with assistant device in the home. That would be about an L2, L3 level because I need hip flexion. But I would also need braces. But if we're looking at, like, say, community ambulation, L3, because I have hip flexion. L3 means I do have some quads. All I would need would be some type of adjustment maybe to the foot, because I can control the knee through the foot. So it depends on what I'm looking for, what type of gait. And then we'll get into spinal cord, depending, like, what muscles are intact at certain levels. But the whole myotome, that testing is important because that'll tell us, what kind of function we can expect back. How about driving a car? What level do you think somebody can drive a car?
All the way to S1.
S1, drive a car?
And the plantar flex.
Okay. So we got S1.
What was the first one you said in terms of evaluation?
Therapeutic.
I don't know, man, they make cars with hand pedals now.
They're driving
They
in
make cars
Tesla.
so you can drive them.
There's people who are paralyzed that can drive.
What level? You guys know mytones.
Do
I mean,
they
I
have,
can get Casey up and do the dance if you want. Anybody needs like a refresher.
do they have a Tesla or a normal car?
See
All
something
you need to
or
do
no?
is like put your hands on it.
See something.
C7 or 8? T1 or
Yeah,
T2?
that's the question.
C6.
C6.
C6. Because you can do it with a handbrake. Although the brake is not like fingers. We don't have fingers yet. It's more just like pushing. So when you're looking at your scapula muscles and your bicep. So C6 with obviously a combination. Somebody can drive a car. Yeah. All right, did I just do the same thing? I gave you guys the same lecture. Hold on.
No, we got it.
No, you have this. Where's the new one?
Neurosystem, we got the new one.
Yeah. Yeah, we're like,
Right
we're
there,
not,
right there.
this one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We still been, oh yeah, we finished.
You just finished.
Yeah.
I'm paying attention.
That's like after, like your cloud is full after like 2 of my lectures. All right, so sensory integration. And this will feed into next week because it's like, what do we do really as therapists? We're trying to like retrain the brain, which is insane in the membrane. Who's that?
Cypress Hill?
Cypress Hill, right? Insane in the membrane. We're trying to, again, like this mapping, brain mapping, this reorganization. Somebody has an injury to the brain, stroke, traumatic brain injury, even MS for that matter. We're trying to retrain, the brain is really in its infancy. Even though we've been studying anatomy for, thousands of years, the brain is really in the infancy of its study in terms of what they're trying to learn. So this integration, the sensory integration is, okay, if I want to get somebody to walk again, to do some type of functional activity, what am I doing to get them to do it? The patient doesn't need to know. You're just training them, giving them the exercises, the practice to get better. What we're really looking to do is, the brain needs to organize, interpret, and use that sensory integration to make purposeful, safe movements. Again, if you're watching child's development, and we talk a little bit about it next week, you can really see this as it comes into play. And even just the development of their bones, right? Your child's bow-legged now, correct? Bow-legged, and it's not until they start to stand where the bones start to develop, the pelvis develops. So when you look at that developmental process, where they'll lie prone, then they start to prop up, now they're developing some control of the head, then they go on quadruped, and then they start to crawl. But being quadruped, what does that do to the bones?
Atrophy?
It's weight bearing, not atrophy. You're developing it. So quadruped, and that's why it's extremely important for children to crawl. Because what quadruped does is that develops the hips, makes them form. It develops the shoulder, the scapula, allows that to form. Starts to give that reciprocal type of pattern. So when you look at the development that you learned last year, I mean, there is a true sequence as to why that happens and how necessary it is for that to happen to go to the next one. Yeah, a kid can go from sitting to walking without crawling in between. That's going to happen. Some kids might take longer, some less. But when you look at that developmental process, it's very important that they do that. So even with the adult population, one of the things that we're going to teach are these developmental patterns. And exercise-wise, like, oh, what can I do with this patient? Well, you know what? We're going to start supine or prone. Then we're going to go to quadruped. So if I have my older patient and I'm prone or supine, then I move them up to quadruped. What have I just done? So they're flat. Now I go to quadruped. What do they need? More than just hip flexion.
Strength.
To stay there, to stay in a quadruped position. They need strength, muscular endurance, head control, trunk control. Then from there, what do you think is next after quadruped? Well, wait, we got a long way to go.
Kneeling?
Kneeling. So I go from quadruped. I got a wide base of support. I need trunk control. I need head control. Now I'll go to kneeling, like a short kneel. I don't hold it. I'm not cramping. I got a short kneel. So what I have, which is different than here, which is a large base of support, now I got a smaller base of support. So now I'm half kneel. Now from here I go to tall kneel. Well, what do I need at tall kneel? I need a lot more trunk control. Smaller base of support. This is a lot harder. I have gravity. From tall kneel, I go to half kneel. Narrow base of support. So now I got to work on balance. And then I need more trunk control. From half kneel, we go to plantigrade. Plantigrade is standing but leaning against something. So I have the support of this. A little larger base of support than standing. But now I need more trunk control, more gravity is against me. And then I go to standing. So with our stroke patients that we get into, hey, I don't know what exercise I can do. Well, let's look at the developmental series. Prone supine, quadruped, short kneel, tall kneel, half kneel, plantigrade, and then standing. So there's a whole sequence of positions I can incorporate to use for that patient. You guys have worked with a patient who had a stroke?
Yeah.
Whether it's flaccid or spastic. Did you ever get him in a quadruped position?
No.
Why not?
They don't have the strength.
Do they need the strength? You come up here. You play dead. You have a flaccid arm. Quadruped. Okay, come on up. Your left side works.
Left side works.
Your left side works. You got a stroke.
Right side
So
works.
get out, come quadruped.
So here.
Yeah, so you're like this.
Yeah.
Why can't I do this?
I mean.
Put your hand flat.
Oh, okay.
All right, lift that left arm up. Reach.
Yeah.
I got you. Reach. Quadruped. What am I doing?
Oh, you're racing out each
No, not. Sorry. Not what I'm doing. What is going on here?
You're still loading the shoulder. You're weight bearing.
We're weight bearing on the shoulder. We're going to learn by putting weight through that shoulder, approximating the joint, that's getting the nerves to start to wake up and fire. So let's say he had a stroke and he's got some flaccidity. I'm going to put him weight bearing and just do that. Or I can say, you know what, even before I get there, let's just have him prone on his elbows. Because that's approximation. I'm going to start to get those muscles to fire.
You still get shoulder girdle strengthening. It's pretty
I'm still, yeah, so, and again, when we talked about the other day, proximal stability for distal mobility, I'm gonna focus on this. Prone on elbows. That prone on elbows, that weight bearing. So, how old's your daughter?
About 4.5 months.
She's not, is she up yet?
Yeah, she goes prone.
Good, and
Not like in quadruped.
not quadruped yet, but is she coming up her elbows yet?
Yeah, you got that.
So she's getting there. She couldn't do it. But now what's going to happen as she's doing it, that's going to start to develop the scapula, the control of the muscle. It's going to form that glenoid fossa. It's going to get the muscles starting to work. And then obviously it gets better. And then in 6 months, when she's up on her elbows like this, all part of that developmental sequence, all part of this integration, using the awareness, the sensation, that feedback. When we put the arm down, and for a child, that bone develops. For an adult, that bone strengthens again. What is that called? When the bone responds, something responds to the stress that you put through it, what is that called? Wolf's Law. Thank you.
Yep.
Good job.
Well, the reason I said no is because I had a stroke patient. They had 2 strokes, and we had to get them to weight bear. But we just directly took them from supine to standing because they couldn't do anything. So it was 2 therapists holding the patient, and Kyle was supporting the knees.
Yeah.
Because yeah, he was supporting the knees because it was just totally flaccid. Like she would have fell. But I see what you're like classic syndromes of the stroke. If they had one strength on one side.
Yeah, I mean, if it's someone like that, yes, it's hard with just one person. However, if they don't support themselves, but if I want to start to develop that, why not get a big bolster? And I'll show you guys in the lab, and then remind me for Friday. Why not get a big bolster? Let's have them go quadruped over the bolster. The bolster is supporting them.
So the biggest issue with quadruped that I run into is like, oh, my wrist hurt. What would you do to combat the wrist situation?
Like I tell everybody that I teach a push-up, I do this. That's it. I like to keep the wrist neutral. That's all I can say. I mean, other than that, yes. Maybe get handles, maybe put a towel. Because, I agree, when you go into too much extension of the wrist, it can hurt. But find, some neutral way. So use the equipment. Again, we'll play with that. Well, I know before I can get them to stand. So to me, if it's like very hard, if I got to work my butt off to get them to stand, work smarter, not harder. All right, let me use a big bolster. Let me get you over the bolster. So the bolster is what's supporting you, but I can still get that proximal control. I can still get the hips to fire in that position. I can get the scapula to fire in that position. Yet the bolster is holding you up, so I don't have to work hard. Certainly something you could try.
Okay.
All right. So provide the foundation with motor programs where purposeful movements are planned, where they're coordinated properly, where they're implemented. So it's like, what are we teaching? And how do we get our thoughts, what we're looking for the patient to do into actual movements through our therapy? But again, there are limitations. Limitations based on the pathology. Again, we know somebody who had a spinal cord injury at, T1 is not going to have trunk control. They're not going to have control of the leg. I'm not going to set a goal that this person's going to walk. Maybe I'll set a goal that this person will transfer independently, that they'll be able to negotiate a wheelchair on multiple surfaces, up and down curves, transfer into a car, drive a car with adaptations. Again, that's the stuff I know. Yeah, independent bed mobility, all stuff like that. Impairments, and again, what is that pathology? What are the problems that it's causing? Weakness, balance issue, cognition. There are functional limitations. Well, that weakness is causing the inability to walk up and down 12 flights or 12 steps, to be able to use, to sleep in the bed, to be able to go to work, to be able to cross the street in enough time as to not get hit by a bus or a car. And then again, your disability. What is it limiting them from, how is that limiting them from surviving or really flourishing in life? Job, social, recreation, stuff like that. So our assessment, we want to determine the ability to respond to stimulus. I'll tell the job interview story in lab, but just remember we talk about alertness. So we want to test the patient's ability to respond to the stimuli. Test arousal, attention, orientation, cognition, memory, hearing, visual acuity. All this stuff affects my patient. If my patient has difficulty walking, afraid of falling, but yet they haven't had a vision test in months or years, and their glasses aren't the right strength, yeah, that's going to affect the problem. Who's got really bad eyesight? Like who wears contacts? You wake up in the morning, what happens? You can't see where you're going. So, yeah. You're stepping on things, you're falling over. So, and vision is big, hearing, all that type of stuff. So alert, we test for arousal, alertness. Is the patient awake and attentive to normal stimuli? So we walk in the room, flip the light on, person's awake, hey, nice to see you, all right, therapy's here, we're waiting for you. All right, they're alert. You walk in, they're drowsy, maybe it's post-surgery, they have the anesthesia still in them, medication, oxycodone, other types of medications. Maybe they have a little Xanax, take the edge off. So lethargy, appears drowsy, may fall asleep if not stimulated. That might be one of those like, hey Dan, just, stay with me, almost done, let's keep doing this. Fall asleep. Obtunded, difficult to arouse, frequent confusion. That will need a repeated stimulation. They'll fall back asleep. That noxious stimuli will wake them up, but they'll fall back to sleep. Your stupor, they only respond to the noxious stimuli. They return to the unconsciousness when the stimuli is taken away. That might be, again, something sharp on their foot, on their hand, something that are really, I don't say painful, but like a jolt will get them up, but then once you take that away, they'll fall back to sleep. And then obviously you have coma, which they cannot be aroused. So attention, selective awareness of the environment, see where they are, ask the patient to ask them a bunch of questions, and just to see if they are in tune to what's going on. A lot of people with confusion, they're in the hospital, they might think they're home. Orientation, awareness to the person, place, or time. So, alertness is different than orientation. You're going to see the AO by 3, right? You guys done chart reviews? Alert, oriented by 3. But know that alertness and orientation are different. If I'm just testing orientation, I'm only going to jot, O by 3, O by 2, whatever it may be. If somebody's oriented, there's a good chance they're alert. But again, just realize that it's two separate things. So orientation, awareness of person, place, or time. Hey, your name, you know where you are, what building you're in, you know what day it is.
Did orientation go up to 4? There's a 4th thing.
If there is, again, I don't know.
Place time.
Date of birth.
Oh, maybe that's.
I think sometimes I've seen, orientation times 4, but I think it's name, date of birth, where you are, and the year and date, or the year and.
So person will be named,
Date of birth.
okay, so that to me is more cognition. Place, and then time. Person, place, time.
I'm not inside of it. I think it might
I'll
be
look it up.
The situation, like, why are you here?
Okay, I'll look it up. That's new to me. I do know the state board, like the study guide is 3. So don't get confused with that 4th one. All right. All right, then you have your cognition. Process of knowing, awareness of judgment, fund of knowledge. Testing the patient's individual learning.
May I have your
No.
attention, please? As we embark on the work event here, we ask that all students, faculty, staff,
I'll just
and
talk about it.
visitors follow
You test their calculation ability.
protocol.
Hey, what's 2 times 2? Can you
Protect everyone
count down from 21 by 3? Again, all testing the cognition.
I repeat, you must wear.
Proverb, I love this one. Proverb interpretation.
Note that each
Interpret the
student
words
has
outside of
vaccination
context.
Unless you have an approved.
The early bird catches the worm.
If
Or,
you feel ill,
which I use for my kids all the time.
and stay
People who live in glass houses
Be
shouldn't
sure
throw stones.
here at each
So when one kid is
we are
like saying
pleased
something bad about the other,
COVID
I'm like, hey, people in glass
on
houses shouldn't throw
campus.
stones.
More information on COVID-19, please visit our website.
The Geico commercial.
www.essex.edu. Thank you for your cooperation.
And eliminate COVID. Okay, sorry. The Geico commercial where 1 in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. About the bird, you know the Geico commercial where they do a take on the Antique Roadshow, and a woman's like, the guy's looking at it, and he's like, oh, this is remarkable. 1 in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. No? It's great.
Pretty good.
That's because I love proverbs. Like I love talking to cliches. It's awesome. All right, Howard.
Well, what does that even mean, the glass house? Is that like
If
if
people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. When I throw a stone, I'm saying something negative or derogatory to you. So I got to look at myself and say, hey, I'm calling you whatever, but but myself is the same. So if I live in a glass house, I shouldn't throw the stone because I'm going to break the house. That's it.
that's gonna be a tough, I failed that one.
Orientation to person. What is your name? How old are you? When were you born? Place. Do you know where you are right now? Yeah, I'm in the hospital. What kind of place is this? Or what town do you live in? Some questions, that you might see, I know some of the questions they might ask is like, where does the president live? Even though it's like place, that's more historical fact. So you're going to see questions like this, just realize, it's got to be like current to that patient for orientation, not necessarily like memory or historical facts. And then the time, what is today's date? What time is it? What season is it? What day of the week? Is it day or night? Stuff like that. Memory, long-term memory, date, place of birth, date of marriage, any type of historical facts. Where'd you go to grammar school? Short-term memory, repeat series of words. Car, book, cup. Hey, I'm gonna give you a couple words. I'll ask you to, recite it back. I'm not gonna tell them when. Say car, cup, book. You go on about your regular treatment, evaluation, assessment, and then you go back. With short-term memory intact, they should be able to recall all 3 words within 5 minutes. After 20 minutes, it becomes 2 words, and that's just normal. A great short-term memory question is, what did you have for breakfast? See if they remember that for a short-term memory. You want to check hearing? You can use the tuning fork, and then also the visual acuity, the Snellen chart, the E, those letters, and then also the peripheral field. Hey, you know what? Tell me when you start to see my finger. Okay, ask them that. Because what happens if we're treating somebody who had a stroke, whatever the condition is, and all of a sudden they have some visual problems, and we're concerned about safety. Well, they don't see that, they lose that peripheral field, they're not going to see the stuff around them. They're not going to see the doorway when they're walking in. So that patient that would walk into the doorway, had a stroke, lost some of that visual field, walk into the doorway. Had a very hard time with the 3 steps to get out of his house. He really couldn't judge that. And so now we have to figure out ways to help with safety. Putting bright yellow tape on the steps, like bright tape on the door, so we can see or identify where the door ended, stuff like that. So type receptors, mechanoreceptors, response to mechanical deformation. Thermoreceptors, change in temperature. Nociceptors is the perception of pain. Chemoreceptors are the chemical substances, oxygen, blood, taste, smell. And then photic receptors are for light. So to test pain, we can do sharp, dull. I'll go through this quickly, we're going to do it in lab. Temperature, take 2 test tubes, one hot, one cold. For light touch, cotton or tissue, identify the location. Vibrations, a tuning fork. So what I want to do is, if I assess the patient, pain, and I know Steve had the reflex hammer, but who has the reflex hammer, the silver one with the black circles? You should all have it?
we all, when we bought the kit.
Yeah, it came with the kit. So we'll break that out. On the top of it, if you screw it off, there's a pin. So I can test pain. I can test sharp and then dull. So with that, I would ask, okay, tell me when you feel. You're going to feel sharp or dull. And I would go along the arm. So what's important is that I document. I can draw an arm out and find out, or a foot, where they feel it. Whether a check mark, yes, they feel sharp. Or an X, that they didn't feel the dull. And so now I have it documented. So I can look at it and say, hey, you know what? In a couple weeks, we're going to do it again. Wow, now you feel. Before you couldn't feel the sharp in your finger, now you're starting to feel it. So what I'm doing is working. Or if something's getting worse. So I would have them either say, okay, tell me if you feel sharp, dull. Do you feel light touch? Or I'm going to prick you with this pin, tell me where it is. And then they can determine tactile sensation. Stereognosis, the ability to recognize common objects. 2-point discrimination, going down as you get distal into the finger, that discrimination should get less. So 2 points of contact, as you get lower, will feel 1, which is normal. But if they don't feel, if it just feels like 1 at it more proximally, well then there's something wrong, some sensation issue. Kinesthetic awareness, the ability to perceive motion. Hey, I'm going to bend your arm up and down. I want you to do the same thing on the other arm. And you see, you assess the type of movement. Are they able to do the same? And then proprioceptive movement, I put one hand in one position, closing my eyes, I should be able to duplicate that. So kinesthetic awareness is dynamic, it's movement. Proprioceptive awareness is more static. Again, I can say, okay, I'm going to close your eyes, I'm going to put your arm out like this. I want you to duplicate that on the other arm. Should be able to do it. Might be off a little bit. Yeah, we document that. That proprioceptive awareness, diminished, stuff like that. Graphesthesia, ability to recognize letters, numbers, or designs traced on the skin. And then barognosis, the ability to identify or recognize different weights. Knowing that there's a difference between one item that's heavier, one item that's lighter. So our questions, what we want to ask, do they have a headache? Any type of head injury, any dizziness or vertigo? Have they had seizures, any tremors, or is there any weakness? So this is what we would use to test. Again, we'll do that in the lab. We're also going to test our cranial nerves. And those in the first lab had the privilege of Professor Doyle coming in, asking for the cranial nerves. Second lab wouldn't have that. But we're going to assess and test the cranial nerves. So for those in the second lab, who's coming to the second lab?
Hi, hello.
All right. How can I test cranial nerve 8?
Got me there, don't remember.
What's that?
Is that the hearing one?
It's hearing, what else?
We use
Balance.
And balance.
Yeah.
spin them in circles and then you see if they can catch themselves.
No, I would just have them stand on one leg.
Okay.
That is the stimulant.
Yeah,
That is the
that's
stimulant, yeah. So we're going to do that. We're going to, the cranial nerve, so you need to know your cranial nerves, the function, and then how do we test it. These are just other stuff. Again, our reflexes, I think it's the same stuff we do in the lab. So you guys have talked about different types of charting. How do I document it? Subjective, no headache. Patient denies headaches, denies seizures, any injury. Reports no weakness or tingling, just whatever they say. For the cranial nerve assessment, to identify or to document it, cranial nerve 1, olfactory, can identify coffee and pepper. 2, vision 20/20, whatever the OSON, peripheral field intact. I can see it now. Motor, no atrophy or weakness. Sensory, intact to pain through the pinprick. Able to identify hot and cold. Decreased sensation to plantar surface of the foot through difficulty identifying the sharp dull. So again, document what you would assess. But you guys can read that there. All right, so the important thing you're going to know come test time will be your dermatomes, myotomes, your cranial nerves, how to test, sort of the definitions, the barognosis, stereognosis, graphesthesia, your, we'll make sure, we'll go over this before your test. And then so this goes back to your spinal nerves, not your spinal nerves, to your spinal tracts, knowing what each convey. So damage to the spinal cerebral tract can be best tested through which of the following techniques. So again, you need to know more than just what spinal tracts there are, but how you would test that. Good? You mean like the dorsal?
Like where it
No.
starts, where it goes, where it ends.
No.
Back. Okay.
No.
I take a class on that. It's not.
Yeah.
Pretty fun, pretty cool.
Oh yeah, and we'll draw it out. It really is. I like to show it.
My sensation receptor class was the neuro professor at
Who was that? Oh, sure. So yeah. I know you're talking about. We met him. We worked together.